Thank you so much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of Chinese Studies Wednesday seminar on Japanese foreign policy, challenges in the post-Abe era. I'm Anushka Saxena and I'm a research intern at ICS and I will be facilitating the session today. The late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzō Abe sought to engage India to build a coalition of maritime democracies. He foresaw that the PRC will further its efforts to mainlandize Taiwan to ultimately annex the island nation. No country alone by itself could deter China's quest for hegemony. India will continue to grow both demographically and economically, and no attempt to build a coalition of like-minded countries over the Indo Pacific maritime domain will be substantive without fully engaging India. The new geopolitical concept of the Indo Pacific thus was born under his resolved leadership, and the Quad security arrangement also took shape as a result. Through the session today, our speaker will look back at what he sought to achieve, for what purposes, and argue that now, with Abe having passed, Japan's diplomacy will likely go in a zigzag, while its foundation is solid than in the pre-Abe era. Tokyo will soon start debating the budgeting process for the next fiscal year. By December, it will revise some of the defense-related policy doctrines as well. The speaker will also address those developments. Please allow me to introduce our eminent panel of experts for today. Joining us, the speaker today is Dr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, who is a professor at the Keio University Graduate School of System Design and Management, where he reads international political economy and the politico-economic development of Japan. Joining us as the discussant today is Dr. Jagannath Panda, who is the head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. He is also the director for Europe-Asia Research Cooperation at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies. Joining us as the chair today is Dr. Shabani Roy Chaudhary, who is a professor in the Japanese Studies Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. The complete bios of the panelists can be perused on the Institute website or in the ICS newsletter. Before I invite the chair to initiate the proceedings, I request the audience to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to stay muted during the presentations. Questions and comments can be posted in the chat box anytime during the event, or you can raise your virtual hand during the interactive session. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair to do so. I now hand over the floor to Professor Chaudhary to take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anushri. Thank you, ICS, for giving us this opportunity. I'm indeed honored to be a chair in a session where Professor Taniguchi would be speaking, and a dear friend of mine, Panda, as a discussant. As all of you know, 8 July 2022 will be etched in the minds of people who love Japan and follow Abe, a transformational statesman who broadened Japan's foreign policy canvas by bringing in the narrative of free and open Indo-Pacific, enabling to shift world's attention to this region, who wholeheartedly worked at creating an alternative to China's rising power, and ensured that nations in this region is involved in this and committed to this whole concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. When Kishida stepped in as Prime Minister after Suga's brief tenure, little did he anticipate a dramatic change in world politics. As he assured that he would follow Abe's legacy, the Ukraine crisis and its aftermath has necessitated a need to recalibrate Japan's foreign policy. Kishida faces high expectations for deft diplomacy because he was Japan's longest-serving foreign minister in the post-war era, and has also been instrumental in many behind-the-scene diplomatic negotiations. Coming as a winner in the upper house election, there's a lot of anticipation both at the domestic decision-making as well as on foreign policy directives, as Anushka has outlined. To understand the dynamics at play, we would not have had a more befitting person than Professor Taniguchi, who has close association with Prime Minister Abe in his international outings, and who wrote the Confluence of the Two Seas speech and keeps close watch of happenings in Japan's political circle and world at large. Today, He is going to be talking to us on Japan's foreign policy challenges in the post-Abe era. Over to you, Professor, and wishing you a happy outing with us here. Could someone please mute your mics? There is a noise somewhere. Please, Rishabh.
Sorry, ma'am.
All right. It's a great opportunity for me to speak about Abe's legacy and talk with you about what could come down the road as regards India-Japanese relationship. Obviously, there was a special niche in Abe's mind whenever it comes to India. No one actually had to tell of the importance of India to the late Prime Minister Abe. I have been wondering why. The first professional experience I had with Shinzō Abe dates back to when Shinzō Abe made a trip to India, as was mentioned, in 2007. 15 years ago, to address the Indian Parliament with a speech entitled Confluence of the Two Seas. He was very much keen on pursuing that agenda, evidence of which was that after he left office due to his chronic illness of ulcerative colitis, in September 2007, he continued to seek as many opportunities as possible to come to India to meet then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and address the think tank community. And I was privileged to be able to help him craft his messages when he came to India. Why was it that there was always a special place in Abe about India? And I think there are two reasons actually. One, he was a born strategic thinker, no exaggeration here. And he wanted to see a broad picture rather than microscopic ones. And he always held Japanese national security very much dear. And in order for Japan to preserve the security around the country and the rules-based international order in and beyond the East Asian region, it was so much obvious that Japan should build very good relationship strategically as well as economically with India. The second reason is to do with the fact that he was born to a political family and he was actually raised on the knees of his grandfather because his own father, when he was very much a small child, was already a very much busy, active member of the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party. His father himself was a prime ministerial aspirant. So on Saturdays and Sundays, he went to his grandfather's home and spent many hours, not with his own father, but his own grandfather, who, this is an interesting part, would tell Shinzō Abe, a young Shinzō Abe, how large an audience he faced aside Premier Nehru in 1957 when Prime Minister Kishida, Abe's grandfather, made a visit to Delhi. This is a narrative that his grandfather, Prime Minister Kishi, would always tell his grandson of Shinzō Abe. Later, after he grew up, he would grasp what motivated Kishi, Prime Minister Kishi, not Kishida, Kishi, his grandfather, to make a visit to India and to get an extended meeting with Prime Minister Nehru, and even addressed a huge crowd in Delhi. Prime Minister Abe came to understand that it was for his grandfather to build his own political capital before embarking upon a journey to Washington, D.C. to see the then U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower. One must be reminded that Japan was very much a weak nation, poor country, far from developed, and yet Japan was exposed to the hottest conflict in the early stages of the Cold War in the Far East. The securing of partnership and military alliance was the topmost priority for Prime Minister Kishi. However, in order for Japan to make a deal with the United States, which was a hegemonic power, much larger in any yardstick, Kishi saw that it would be imperative for Japan and for himself to be equipped with a larger amount of political capital. He found an ideal place to seek that opportunity, standing next to Prime Minister Nehru. It should go without saying that Prime Minister Nehru at the time was a towering champion of the Third World cause. And Prime Minister Kishi, representing the poor, war-devastated nation, was nonetheless welcomed and even applauded by the members of the Indian politics, Nehru and others, and the huge crowd of India helped him boost his political capital and confidence. And that is something that Shinzō Abe, when young, used to learn from his own grandfather. Now, for us to talk about Japanese diplomacy, what is important is, number one, location, number two, location, and number three, location. I sometimes wonder if Japan were somewhere else where, for instance, New Zealand is. If you put Japan onto the map of New Zealand, these two nations are not so much different, almost the same size, and Japan would be very much a neutral country if Japan was placed in the region where New Zealand is. But this but is very much important, and I must elaborate on this but by sharing my screen with you. It's just a brief presentation. It's just 5-page slide presentation. And let me just share my slide. Right. This is something that many of you have done yourself. That is to use the truesize.com website and handpick a country of your choice and put it on the map of your choice. So what I did was to handpick China and put it on the continental European map. And listen, there will be no Turkey, no Ukraine, no Germany, no France, no Italy, no Poland, no not even a big part of Russia. And I would ask visitors, while I was working with the Japanese Prime Minister's office, I met a number of people coming from other countries. And so whenever I met visitors from the UK, I posed this question: what if your European map was like this? What kind of offshore balancing tactics could you possibly exert upon European countries? Because Europe is simply a one nation. People don't necessarily understand the sheer scale, the sheer size of China. Maybe the Indians would better understand the weight of India, because you must look up to India from your side over the Himalayas. So India and Japan share the same sort of special perspective about China. And this is about Europe, and I did the same on the North American continent. More and more Americans are very, very much alarmed by the growth of Chinese military, advancement of Chinese scientific knowledge, and huge leap that China is making on cutting edge technologies such as AI and quantum computing and so on and so forth. But not many people, even in Washington, D.C., have ever thought that China would be this big if put on the North American continent. And don't forget, this is actually the geographic size that people in the Far East, like Japan, Japanese, always feel. And this is where Japan is, and this is how the Indo Pacific region looks like. And it tells you that the concept of Indo Pacific is all about seascape, not landscape. And it is befitting because Japan is an island nation dependent on the sea-based trade. And Japan is the nation that hosts the largest naval footprint of the United States. So Japan from the east, India from the west, must stand and work together to safeguard the rules-based international maritime order, first and foremost. And this shows you how Shinzō Abe came to view this region and why he talked about the confluence of the two seas. It's so much obvious, isn't it? If you look at this map, there is no separation between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Just a couple of points about the parliamentary address that Shinzō Abe gave in 2007. It was an act of investment on the part of Japan in the future of India. In 2007, it was already a common knowledge that India would be bigger, both demographically and economically, in due course. And given the fact that in India there is a sense of responsibility as regards maintaining the peace and the rules-based order in the vast stretch of the waters from the Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific. With that in mind, Shinzō Abe made that speech and talked about the dynamic confluence of the two seas. And this is certainly because Japan is feeling very much that the shadow of Chinese maritime power is extending almost daily. And this is about where Japan is in its own close neighborhood. Forget about the 3 pins, but my point here is never before has Japan been exposed to the combination of 3 hostile, undemocratic nuclear nations: Russia, North Korea, China. Very few OECD member nations, for instance, have had this kind of, let's say, dangerous neighborhood. South Korea being a member of the OECD, so maybe South Korea and Japan are the only nations that share borders with these 3 undemocratic, hostile nuclear nations. Shinzō Abe met Vladimir Putin 27 times, and that was only because by somehow forging the long overdue peace treaty with Vladimir Putin's Russia, Japan could perhaps a little bit lessen the tension from up north, so that Japan, by using its limited resources, could focus its military attention on the southwest. It didn't work. It didn't work at all. So Japan and Russia have come full circle. No advancement has been made. It has been a pity, but this is where Japan is, and it gives you a compelling rationale as to why Japan should reach out and forge partnerships and alliances with like-minded maritime nations. So this is a foundational environment, no matter who is taking office in Japan. Now, Prime Minister Kishida is looking at the same picture, and I will touch on that later a little bit. Finally, this is about the original shape of Quad. By original shape, it means that when Shinzō Abe came back in office the second time as Prime Minister, December 2012, he immediately published an op-ed piece on the web-based publication of Project Syndicate. And the title of the article was Asia's Democratic Security Diamond. Why diamond? You can see Kolkata, Darwin, anti-clockwise, Hawaii, and Tokyo. If you combine these 4 dots, it would give you a diamond-shaped picture. And you see that East China Sea, South China Sea, and the much part of the Indian Ocean would be covered by this diamond. And given the fact that Japan and Japan and the United States, and Australia and the United States are treaty alliance partners, India was a missing link, but most fortunately, due to the effort made jointly by the Indian leaders and Japanese leaders, notably Narendra Modi and Shinzō Abe, now we are able to talk about Quad. Quad, in my view, is still in its fledgling stage, and it's too early for anyone to talk about how to institutionalize Quad. It's still important for those individual leaders, Joe Biden, Kishida, and Albanese, and Narendra Modi, to meet as frequently as possible and develop the habit of mind to whenever meet, to speak on whatever important issues among themselves. Now, this is the final page of my presentation, and I'll close my sharing and give you my two scenarios to conclude my presentation. One scenario, rather optimistic, another pessimistic. Pessimistic first. Why pessimistic? Because there have been two streams of thoughts within the Liberal Democratic Party for many decades. One was the one that Shinzō Abe belonged to, which always looks at Japanese national security concerns first. Call it national security group. Another, headed by the group that Kishida belongs to, always put more emphasis than national security on more emphasis on economic well-beings than on national security. It might sound odd for you, because without national security, it's useless for anyone to speak about economic well-beings. However, for many decades, it was actually the United States that did the dirty jobs. Asia around Japan, East Asia around Japan, was far from a peaceful place. It should go without saying that hot wars were fought in Korea, in the Indochina Peninsula, none of which actually involved any single soldier from the Japanese self-defense forces. So for those economy-first leaders, they were so much accustomed to the fact that there was actually no need for Japan to seriously contemplate what to be done to secure Japanese national security, because dirty jobs were all done by the Americans. And so economic first group of people chose to pay less attention on national security, whereas the reality is Japan's region was far from peaceful for many decades. So there is a stream of that sort of thought still to be found among Japanese LDP politicians. And I would say Kishida started off as someone who does not want to pay much attention on national security and wants to pay more attention on economics. But so if you think about that, one must be relatively pessimistic. Pessimistic as to the fact that as to whether or not Japan should build on its own capital to further cement Quad, for instance, to further strengthen India-Japan military ties. But more optimistic scenario, this is the end of my presentation, would say that the foundational stone was already laid and it would be intact. And more importantly, where Japan is location-wise couldn't change. So Japan is faced with the combination of three hostile nuclear powers. It's a reality that's not going to go away. And I think Prime Minister Kishida is learning rather fast that this is very much a reality that Kishida could not close eyes to. So that would be it. At the end of this year, by the end of this year, there would be revisions of national security strategy, and there would be a newly issued strategic report about what to be made, what to be done to strengthen Japanese self-defense forces. Already, I think Kishida has decided that Japan should equip itself with counter-strike capabilities against China. Taiwan is very much a central key issue. It suffice it to say that if you lose Taiwan, you would lose a lot of things together. For instance, U.S. Forward deployed forces, notably its 7th Fleet naval presence, would be much less meaningful if you lose Taiwan. The waters around Taiwan would effectively be anti-access area denial zone for the Chinese. And they're looking at the golden opportunity. The Chinese are looking at when would be the golden opportunity to annex Taiwan at all cost. And it's no longer a question whether or not China is going to somehow annex Taiwan. I think it's how soon. What kind of tactics would be used would be a different set of questions. I will conclude here, and I'd be very much happy to take whatever questions you might wish to raise. I spent a total of about 10 years with Abe, and I saw that he tried to tackle many things like economic difficulties and the need to boost the morale of the young men and women in Japan, and so on and so forth. So any questions would be welcome. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Taniguchi-sensei. I think you've laid the platter out for people to think and question, but I think it will be most engaging to have Dr. Panda discuss what you've said right now. There's lots of things that can be worked around. Over to you, Panda.
Let me at the outset thank Institute of Chinese Studies, Professor Acharya and Professor Roy Chaudhary for this kind invitation. And it's a great pleasure to always appear in an event where Taniguchi-sensei is speaking. One of the most important aspects of his speech here is that he brings personal account from that glory. And I think that has to be appreciated in a scholarly manner. No matter how much we debate and discuss more from a observation point of view or from a scholarship point of view, I think the personal account that Taniguchi-sensei brings here about Abe Shinzō, that would be really, going on the track as a memoir and also as a strong academic outlets in times to come. And I think one of the most important point Taniguchi-sensei made is that what actually made Abe special and why he saw India as a special partner. And I think two things that is emerging clearly from his assessment is that he said that, Abe was a strategic thinker. He was born as a strategic thinker. And I think that explained a lot. And I think from the 2007, that outstanding speech in the Indian Parliament, that Taniguchi-sensei had a great hand to, shape the speech and finalize. I think that set the tone for the next 1 decade or 2 decades to come. And that particular speech not only gave a kind of outlet about what kind of Abe thinking is Japan is going to pursue in times to come, but also what Japan rightfully need in workplace. And I think one of the outstanding element of that speech is that the narrative, the beautiful narrative of geography that Taniguchi-sensei was mentioning about. That I think geography is the most final and distant destinator. And I think in that context, probably Japan is caught in a very strategic, in a strategic dilemma, how to face the security challenges. India too is caught in a geographic dilemma, and we cannot change the geography. And I think in that particular speech, we see a fine marriage between Japan and India, and which was rightfully, said for the next 1.5 decade to come. The second fact that the second point that Taniguchi-sensei most aptly mentioned, and I think his Abe Shinzō's political background. And I think that brought a lot of maturity to his political thinking, which we don't really see in other Japanese leaders. And I think it is yet to be seen whether Prime Minister Kishida will really survive in power that long and try to bring the changes that Abe wanted to bring or that LDP wanted to bring. But then I think one of the outstanding feature of Abe Shinzō was his political background, his political family, his political legacy, and the maturity, the political maturity he brought to his prime ministers. But again, I think one other point that really was very striking about Taniguchi Sensei's speech, when he said that, Abe possibly did not see Japan as a neutral country. And I think that was, one of the most important contribution, I would say, that in 21st century geopolitics, a country does not have to be a neutral one. And I think I would make that point probably, drawing my stay here in Sweden, where there was a lot of debate and strategic debate every day was going on for last few, couple of years, that why Sweden needs to really join NATO. Sweden does not have to make this decision. Sweden's foreign policy has been quite neutral, and Sweden needs to maintain an autonomous position on most of the global pressing issues. But today, I think there is a departure in Sweden's foreign policy. So the point here needs to be noted is that when Sweden today is joining NATO and made the bid to join in NATO, so it became clear that in the 21st century, no country should ideally be a neutral country. They have to take a position and they have to become a part of the real politics. And to that extent, I think Abe Shinzō saw Japan's virtue to build an alliance in Indo Pacific in years to come. And I think most of the credits goes to his leadership and political acumen. But what I would be, as a discussant, probably what I would also invite Taniguchi Sensei's comments on a range of few issues that as a scholar, everybody dealing with Japan, dealing with China or East Asia, particularly from India, would be interested to know. One is that I think, how do you see the political instability from now on returning back in Japan? Because there is a strong note that even the Prime Minister Kishida is holding on to power right now, but probably we might see at some stage political instability returning back to Japan. So how do you see the Abe legacy might bind the LDP together in times to come? Do you see that, the kind of, Indian foreign policy where Nehru left a hallmark and the Congress party actually was united for a long time under Nehru? And then if we take the example from BJP, we saw, BJP was also in a way united under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the former Prime Minister of India. So do you see the LDP will stay as a united force within that Abe legacy? The second point I would be interested to know about, the legacy of Abenomics. And I think Abe economics or Abenomics was one of the outstanding feature of Shinzō Abe's contribution to, Japan's economic and political fortune. And of course, if we know Abenomics, probably one of the most important aspect was how to deal with China's chronic deflation problem that Japan was, facing. Most of the most of the East Asian countries were facing. So I think Abenomics aimed to address the deflation issue in Japan. That was the most important issue. How do you see? And here I would, encourage you to comment, dealing with Abe, dealing with the current, economic scenario, post-pandemic economic scenario in Japan. How do you see Japan dealing some of these pressing problems, where unemployment is still a problem, where, deflation is still a problem? So how do you see these problems continuing? And do you think Abe Shinzō, as a political leader, or Abenomics really did try to address some of this problem? The two other points that I would invite your comments, and probably there you might comment a little elaborately, which will interest each one of us listening here, given the legacy of Institute of Chinese Studies. And I think Abe Shinzō's China policy, and I think that has been a under-researched topic and also most debated topic in some ways, but under-researched topic at the same time. And I would say that probably if we see Abe Shinzo's China policy, I would read it that it was very much nationalist, yet it was very much pragmatic. How do you define Abe's China policy? To my opinion and to my assessment, more as a scholar, on Chinese foreign policy and Chinese domestic politics, I have seen that probably Abe revived the balancing act in its foreign policy. In fact, even though Abe did not really propounded the Seikei Bunri approach, but he did in some ways revive the Seikei Bunri approach in the Japanese foreign policy and Japanese approach towards China. And the Seikei Bunri approach was to keep the politics separate from economics. China as an economic power and China as a politico-military power has to be seen differently. And that's what Abe taught us. So I would invite your comments. How much imprint Abe has left for the future generation leaders in Japan on his China policy? My last point would be probably to invite your comments and to discuss a little bit about Taiwan issue that you brought in towards the end of your lecture. Is that I think probably to my understanding, if we take a very realistic assessment of past 5 to 7 Japanese leadership, no Japanese leadership probably realized the importance of Taiwan in world politics and the importance of Taiwan for Japan than Abe Shinzo. And I think to that extent, he succeeded in making not only Japanese foreign policy to focus and revive, to have a more rebuilding approach towards Taiwan, but also what he interestingly did is that he opened a range of official channel of communications with the Taiwanese officials. So there, and I think partly the credit goes to you, and I have been reading some of your literature where I could see that you have played a significant role in terms of shaping this thought. So I would invite your comments is that how do you see, where did Abe really maintain a real balance between China and Taiwan in the cross-strait ties? And what was actually one of those outstanding features that one would like to remember about Japan's Taiwan policy under Abe Shinzo? If you could comment on some of these issues, that would be very useful. But again, and I think I will be failing in my duty if I do not compliment for your outstanding speech. There is a lot you have said which needs to be, unpacked in terms of research for the future generation. And one last point also, which has been striking in your speech, is that when you mentioned that how Abe Shinzo saw that Japan is facing the tripartite hostile authoritarian powers, that is, Russia, that is North Korea, and China. And I think to that extent, probably his idea of building that Indo Pacific alliance does have significant merits in times to come. So I will compliment here by saying that it's been a wonderful speech from you, and I have learned a lot. But I would encourage you if you could comments on some of my questions and comments. That will be wonderful, a learning process in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panda. I think that was a brilliant set of 4 questions for me to ponder. Instability, Abenomics, China, Taiwan, in that order, if I remember that correctly. Japan looks stable. Japan looks tranquil. Japan looks calm, primarily because the country is losing young and kinetic bunch of people. It's an aging society. Baby boomer generation is aging fast and rapidly, giving much more burden on the provision of national security. Many of you might perhaps be surprised if I would tell you the following. Japan is spending a total of 120 trillion Japanese yen. You must use a forex calculator, but Japan is spending a gross total of 120 trillion yen for the provision of national social security, not national security, social security. And the lion's share of that money is being spent for the elderly, needless to say. How large this amount, 120 trillion yen? It is larger in amount than the US defense budget, Chinese defense budget, Russia's, Saudi Arabia's, and India or France's, all put together. So Japan's welfare provision is larger than the combined sum of annual defense budget for those five biggest defense spenders, including the United States. What sort of political instability could you envisage in these circumstances? The widening fault line is between the young and the elderly. The young do not rebel. The young do not hit the street and yell and scream that we should get away with the elderly. You know, that's the sort of thing that no one dares to say. However, young people are becoming less and less interested in Japanese politics, and fewer people within the young generation spend money on their own pension scheme because they are losing faith in the Japanese pension system. And if you, as Prime Minister of Japan, should continue to cater mostly to the elderly, you would lose support from the young. And if you look at how stringent the COVID-19 restrictions have been in Japan, many of you have had tremendous difficulties in reaching the soil of Japan because Japan is still closing. It is for the elderly. It is to cater to the interests of the 70-something, 80-something, 90-something, because they are the vulnerable bunch of people against the COVID-19 viruses. And yet, young people, teenagers and 20-something and 30-something, even if they suffer from COVID-19, they have recovered rather fast and they have recovered rather well. So it's now time for Japan to do the same as most other nations, including India. But notwithstanding, because of the anxiety among the elderly, the Japanese politicians don't have guts to say the otherwise. And I think that's a cause of generational battle, and that's a cause of instability. And already the blogosphere opinions, SNS opinions are becoming harsher against Kishida, saying that Kishida says much, but does very little. He talks the talk, but he has hardly walked the talk. Today, he said Japan needs to reactivate as many nuclear reactors as possible. That's very much a good decision because Japan is losing its stability of power provision. So now Japan needs to activate what can be activated, the nuclear reactors. But people are scratching their heads as to whether or not Fumio Kishida could actually deliver what he said he would deliver. But let's be kinder. Kishida is endowed with a golden opportunity of not having general elections for 2 long years. If he was wise, I wish he was. I wish he is. If he was wise, he could tackle some of the difficult questions up front. Once you start observing that your prime minister tackling the root cause of the problems, then the prime minister could earn more credit and could earn more popularity ratings. So that's about the first question. Instability might surface due to this deepening fault line of the generation divide. Second, about Abenomics, it's the extension of what I have already told you about the political instability. For a country like Japan, you couldn't rely upon the increasing labor input. And one must be reminded that there are only 3 strings to pull to grow your economy. This is on the supply side. First, labor input, capital stock, and productivity, or total factor productivity, to be more precise. In order for any one of these levers to be pulled, be it labor input, capital stock, and productivity, one needs to have the most important asset, the most important commodity, if I may say so, which is in scarce supply. What is it? It's hope. It's hope for the future. Especially the young people do not have hope for the future because they see every day old people, elderly citizens are depending more and more upon the money that the young people give. So Shinzō Abe saw that it would be most important for the Japanese government to sow the seeds of hope for the future and for the future generations. How did he think he could do that? By opening Japan up further to link Japan more firmly with the global economy, even in circumstances where anti-globalization is in vogue. So TPP-11 was forged. Japan and EU forged similarly a mega EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. And so Japan, under Shinzō Abe, came to be exposed more, not less, to the international competition. And he thought it would be very much important for Japan's young generations to be exposed to the competition from the external part of the world. In order to slowly but gradually increase your population, young people, a young man and a young woman, either in wedlock or out of wedlock, whatever, must be forthcoming about their future. Otherwise, they wouldn't like to have a baby. And if so, it's going to be hopeless for Japan. So Abenomics made a transition from a package of short-term remedies to something that tackles the long-standing, deep-rooted issues. And certainly this is halfway house. It's in its midway, but I think it's an important agenda to be carried out after the next prime minister and even after that. So that's about Abenomics. Third, China. Shinzō Abe, when he came back in office December 2012, started to use a phrase if I may translate the Japanese into English, one must look at the world as if you look at the globe. In other words, one must adopt the bird's eye view to see the direction in which Japan should go to. And everyone knew that it was a euphemism of his own strategy towards China. And it could have been interpreted the following way. It was almost impossible for Japan to stand on a par with China, given the fact that China is growing very fast economically and militarily. So Japan needs to boost its capital, political, reputational, economic, and strategic by building first closer ties with partner nations and alliance partner nations, which is why he first tried to mend the broken fences between the United States and Japan, and he made a success on that. And he also traveled as many countries. He also made a journey to as many countries as possible. And only after he succeeded in earning trust, confidence, and capital from many democratic, like-minded nations, he reached out to Xi Jinping. And I think it's very much important for us to be strong whenever we meet the Chinese leaders, because Xi Jinping knows who is strong, who is weak. And especially when it comes to the fact that we are all running something called election calendars. They are the ones who know that, Prime Minister Kishida must face another election. If he loses the next one, his popularity ratings would go down, and then he would be very much weak. Let's just wait and see how he fares. This is something that Xi Jinping and North Korean leaders and all do, which is why it is very much important, although difficult, for a democratically elected leader to stay and remain a strong presence. And luck worked, but Shinzō Abe made it possible to win 6 national general elections in a row. And gradually Xi Jinping changed his views towards Abe. So when Abe was killed, there was a message Xi Jinping sent to his wife. And I think that was an expression of his heartfelt emotions. So Xi Jinping came to appreciate Shinzō Abe's power. If, on the contrary, he started off by reaching out first to China, then Xi Jinping might have seen that act as an expression of weakness. That's something that one should not do. Scott Morrison, who is having a huge trouble in his own country now, but always said that when it comes to dealing with China, what Shinzō Abe does can be a good guide for Australia to strike a balance between its economic interests and strategic interests. Japan's economy could not live a day without relying upon Chinese economy. The garment chain operation of Uniqlo has much more stores and shops in China than in Japan. Honda, once a country that put almost all the assets on the North American market, is now making much more cars in China and selling more to the Chinese consumers than in the United States. So Honda is putting faith more on China and relatively less on the United States. Such being the case, no Japanese prime minister could rock the boat so much. It's a fine balance that should be cut. And the point here is, if you wish to cut a good balance between economic interests and strategic, you must first build your own political capital. And that brings us back to what Abe's grandfather did with Nehru before Prime Minister Kishi meeting Dwight Eisenhower. And Shinzō Abe borrowed that strategy from his grandfather when dealing not with the United States, but this time with China. Taiwan. In 2024, the current Taiwanese president is going to leave office. Her term is going to expire. In 2024, there would be a presidential election. I read a relatively long Taiwan white paper, as many of you have already done yourselves. And I think it was very much striking in the sense that it clearly laid out that the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan must be removed. And that's what the Taiwan white paper said very clearly. And this is the third such white paper that the Chinese Communist Party has published. And it is a document that Xi Jinping, in his third term as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, would use. And that's telling, because you could interpret what the Taiwan white paper says as follows. The Chinese Communist Party would do as much as possible to manipulate the public opinions in Taiwan so that the independent-minded Democratic Progressive Party should be removed, quote unquote, from the political scene in Taiwan. And in 2027, 5 years from now, Xi Jinping is going to have to face yet another contest, judgment as to whether Xi Jinping will have done a good job as the ultimate leader of the Chinese Communist Party. So, if you put yourself into the shoes of Xi Jinping, you would say that I'd have to do as much as I can to prove that I am as great as any leader in Chinese history by completing the long overdue China dream, by finally bringing in Taiwan into the Chinese orbit. And in 2027, it just happens that the PLA, People's Liberation Army, is going to celebrate its centenary. So from now onward, in 2024, the presidential election, 3 years after that, 2027 PLA centenary, Xi Jinping's another test, another contest. So the next 5 years will be very much an important period, and Japan cannot lose sight from these developments. And what's important is to do what's necessary, namely invest into Japanese economy, try to boost its economy, and try to continue to build its military capabilities with like-minded nations. So herein comes yet another importance of India, because India and Japan could hoist a banner of freedom and liberty, human rights, and democratic institutions. And one thing that, if there is one thing that the Chinese leaders feel uneasy about, is their political legitimacy. Political legitimacy is in the hands of us, the Indians and the Japanese. That would be it.
Thank you, Sensei, for such an insightful answering to the questions. I will withhold my questions because the box is full of questions from the audience. So quickly, let us go over to the audience question. First question we have is from Ambassador Krishna Radha. He says that, is it correct that after the very tragic departure of Abe, Japan's relationship with Russia are now without a real champion? Does this create problem in moving forward in the Tokyo-Moscow dialogue?
The short answer to your question is true. There is no driver, either in Russia or in Japan. Vladimir Putin and Shinzō Abe, by meeting 27 times, reassured each and every time that if not now, when? If not us, who else? And that was the mantra that Vladimir Putin and Shinzō Abe used all the time. But to the disappointment of many in Tokyo, Vladimir Putin, when it comes to dealing with these sorts of issues, was not a quintessential dictatorial authoritarian leader. He was an institution man. He was sitting on a balance of interests of oligarchs and others. So he was a lone figure interested in striking a deal with Tokyo. So it did not actually move an inch forward. And Russia was not interested. Russia would not tolerate Japan remaining a alliance partner with the United States when the 2 or 3 or 4 islands would be given back to Japan. After the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, diplomatic channels were put into halt. Japan is imposing a full-fledged set of sanctions against Russia. So Japan and Russia have come a full circle. No progress in retrospect has been made. And I wouldn't imagine there would be any single influential player on either side who would emerge to push the negotiations forward.
Shruti?
Professor Shabani, do you mind if I read the next question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Anushka. Thank you.
Please.
Right. So the next question is from Chanda Shekhar, and it asks, realism diplomacy in the new era, articulated by PM Kishida in the IISS Dialogue 2023, in alliance with India's inclusive and open Indo Pacific posturing. How do you see that, Professor Taniguchi?
I couldn't actually listen to your question, but it's about IISS meeting and what Kishida said for that gathering, and whether or not there would be convergence between Indian policies and Japanese policies. Did I understand it correctly?
Yes, you did.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. I don't think there is any question about it. There is convergence. There is convergence to be made between the Indian and the Japanese policies. let's just be more creative in answering that question. There has been much talk going on about the imperative of investing into the port facilities in the Andaman Nicobar archipelago. This is just one example, but you have a very much important strategic asset off the Strait of Malacca, and the Indians and the Japanese, and why not Australians and Americans, could join forces to build a strategic facilities in the Andaman Nicobar archipelago. That's just one example, but it's very much important for India and Japan to work together to showcase, most importantly to Beijing, that when it comes to setting rules and norms, it is us, the democratic powers, that should take responsibility of doing that. So for that matter, my point, if I may reiterate again, is that there must be an effort jointly by the Indian leaders and Japanese leaders to develop a habit of mind to always think strategically together.
Ma'am, the next question that we have is from Ambassador Kanta, who asks, how do you see the prospects for Japan's emergence as a normal country, pursuing its national interests and taking regional security responsibilities, say with regard to Taiwan, unencumbered by the baggage of its past and the presumed guilt of its history?
Presumed guilt of its history is prominent between South Korea and Japan, and between China and Japan. But those are the only countries, I'm not exaggerating, that have used the history baggage as leverage against Japan. And it could change. The new administration of South Korea is trying to use a different tack vis-a-vis Japan, although the current South Korean administration's ruling party is very much weak in the South Korean parliament. So the posture of the president could change very fast. China gets softer towards Japan whenever there is a growing difficulty vis-a-vis the United States. And that seems to be the case as well. China is telling the Japanese that Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Kishida should at least meet online or over the phone. That's something that Beijing is now telling Tokyo. And the normal nation debate was less important, became very less, is now less important than it was 20 years ago. Why? Because Shinzō Abe spent a substantial amount of his political capital to legislate new security bills, which have enabled Japanese self-defense forces to finally act in tandem as a collective unit with the American armed forces in and around Japan. The new bills would not allow Japanese armed forces to go to Afghanistan, for instance, to work as a unit under the US command. So the classic example of collective defense is something that Japan should yet be able to do, but Shinzō Abe's legislative bills enabled Japan to exercise the collective defense, albeit in a limited scale, and that's one. And second, It is the American forces that have been under the protection provided 24/7, 365 days by the Japanese armed forces. True, it is the US naval boats and US aircraft that are being protected by the Japanese self-defense forces, and it was made possible also by the legislative bill that Shinzō Abe succeeded in passing the parliament. It's called the number 95 article, section 2 of Japanese self-defense forces. That allows Japanese armed forces to work with the Americans to provide security to the Americans. And let me tell you, the older generations had mixed emotions about America and about the US military presence in particular. It took Shinzō Abe's generation, i.e. my generation, to become more confident about who we are, who the Japanese are, and who started to view the presence of US forces on our own soil of Japan, not as a liability, but as an asset. And Shinzō Abe was able to say the difficult president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, that you must continue to station your troops on the soil of Japan because it would be far less costlier for you to do that than having their troops on the soil of the United States. So for him, it is not a question whether or not the United States might withdraw from the world stage. The question that he always posed to himself was, what should Japan do further to continue to bring in the Americans, to continue to engage the Americans as much as possible, because the presence of US military would be even more important in this age of the Indo Pacific prosperity. So in a nutshell, Japan has become much, much more normal than in the past.
Thank you for the detailed response. With the permission of the chair, I'd like to combine two questions regarding domestic politics. So this question is by Ms. Yukti Pawar, who asks, what are the possible changes in Japanese foreign policy due to changes in factionalism within the LDP? Are there any other undermined contributing factors which are bringing change to Japanese foreign policy? In a similar line, Dr. Sudeep Kumar asks, in a recent Menchi poll, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrongly, the approval rate of the Kishida government is at an all-time low of 36%. What is the actual reason behind the sudden drop in the approval rate of the Kishida government? Can Kishida's unity cabinet survive the next 3 golden years?
Thank you. If I may reiterate what I touched upon, the foundation of Japanese foreign policy could not change. Where Japan is as regards location should remain the same, which is why there is actually very narrow option for Japan's diplomatic policies. The scope of options is very, very narrow. Emphasis to be put on many elements of Japanese diplomacy may alter, may change. For instance, to my demise, to my disappointment, may I say that there has been much, much less appetite shared by Kishida people for TICAD, which is an abbreviation of Tokyo International Conference on African Development. And Japan has been a champion of aiding Africa, sub-Saharan African nations, before China came to play a much more prominent role. This year, it is being designed to make this year a very much important year because the TCAD conference goes to Tunisia at the end of this month. But Kishida caught COVID-19, and he is making his self-quarantine by enclosing himself in a prime minister's official residence. So he chose to do everything online. And that indicates that Kishida does not actually pay interest in things like African diplomacy. That sets Kishida quite apart from Abe, who was very much keen on bringing Japan closer to African nations. I still remember vividly that Shinzō Abe delivered an address to the general meetings of the United Nations. And whenever he finished his speech outside of the hall, there was a long queue made up mostly by African diplomats who wanted to shake hands with Shinzō Abe. Shinzō Abe was almost like a rock star seen by those African diplomats. And I wouldn't imagine that Kishida would earn a similar amount of trust and friendship from African nations. This is not an important matter. No, this is very much an important matter, because if you look at African nations, they are succumbing towards Beijing's authoritarian call, and it would serve no one's interest. It would serve no interest of the Japanese and let me say Indians as well. So the lack of interest on the part of Kishida as regards African diplomacy is telling, and it's disappointing. The huge drop of approval ratings is to do with the fact that the media are making such hype about the connection between LDP and prominently Abe's group with the Union Church, the Moonies. The Union Church, the Moonies, were very much active when I was a college student, meaning 40 years ago. 40 years ago, it was a cult, and it was interested in doing whatever sort of things that would be necessary to boost its support base. Still, there is a bunch of people who had to pay an extra amount of money for the cause of the Moonies, and many of them might have been brainwashed. So there must be checks and balances towards the Union Church. That said, it is about faith. It's a faith organization, and it's passed aside. It is relatively peaceful now. Nonetheless, media made a narrative as if to say, because Shinzō Abe gave a video address together with Donald J. Trump to the international gathering of the Union Church, he aroused anger in an isolated young man whose mother went bankrupt after spending so much money on the cause of the Union Church. He had to be killed by that man. This is an awful sort of argument. But it's being found that even the opposition party members, some of the prominent members of the oppositions, have also given lip services to the Union Church. So this, I hope, is going to subside by the time the state funeral is going to be held on the 27th of September, hopefully with the presence of Narendra Modi. But that's been the reason. More deeply, may I say, Kishida must be able to deliver what he said he would deliver, much faster, and much more quickly, because he has been observed by young generations, whether on which side Kishida stands, whether Kishida is going to be on the side of the elderly, whether Kishida is going to be more friendly towards the future generations. And you must be very much careful to strike a very good balance again, because you couldn't lose your elderly voters because they are the religious voters. But the future lies not in the hands of 70s, 80s, 90s, but future lies in the 20s or the teenagers. And Kishida must win trust from those people. Now, by the way, Abe lowered the age threshold of voters from 20 to 18. So now high school seniors could vote, and they are, for high school seniors, they are going to live for the next, I don't know, 80 years. So Kishida or whoever else must think 80 years down the road, and he is being watched whether he is entitled to do that.
Thank you for that response. We've almost run out of time, and this is the last question for today. Japan is looking forward to upgrade its defense capabilities, boosting its defense spending as well. Will this in any way impact its long-standing aid policy, which was an important segment of its foreign policy for so many years?
Yes, aid policy. The sheer gross total amount of aid is being smaller and smaller for many years. And I think it's very much difficult to turn it around. So one must be more creative and knowledge-based to pursue Japanese aid policy when Japan couldn't afford spending more money abroad to aid. The growth of Japanese military spending could negatively affect the official developmental assistance. Well, not necessarily. The picture is the following. You get an annual budget of Japanese central government. That's not small in amount. The annual budget of Japanese central government in amount, money-wise, is bigger than Saudi Arabia's GDP, Turkey's GDP. So you're talking about a big, big pie. However, 70% of that pie is fixed. Why so? One, social welfare, especially the healthcare cost for the elderly. It's fixed. Second, national debt obligation. You must pay back your government debt. You must pay the interests of the government bonds. So national debt obligation is the second. You couldn't do anything about it. Third, subsidies towards the municipalities. You have hundreds of small municipalities, none of which is self-reliant, with the exception of Tokyo, where you get many headquarters of corporates. So these three elements are fixed. You could do nothing about it. You're only talking about the rest, 30% of the pie. So before talking about who cancels out what, which part cancels out what, you must start debating how to grow your pie, how to make the pie bigger. And that's the challenge of Prime Minister Kishida's. there also he zigged and zagged. If you remember that, he initiated his policy by focusing more upon distribution before thinking harder about growing. Now he is shifting his gears towards growth. That sort of zigging and zagging is being seen as a sign of weakness, and that actually helped his popularity ratings go south rather than north. May I stop there?
Thank you, Professor Taniguchi. I think when a speaker addresses a large canvas from societal to domestic to foreign policy, I think we at ICS should feel proud to have had you and hope to have you back over and over again, because you have not only touched upon what Japan's societal concerns are, but you have plugged it to how it creates instability to the whole, Japan's own instability, which will obviously manifest itself in the international arena. Thank you, Dr. Panda, for joining us and putting forth a set of questions to Taniguchi Sensei. Not an easy thing to do because he's so articulated what he says. I really appreciate your time and that you give it for this discussion. I must thank the audience being so engaging and flooding the chat box with so many questions. We really had a good outing today, and I really wish you a very good evening and back to your drawing rooms with a cup of tea, to your dinner and to your breakfast or lunch for Panda. Thank you everybody for joining us. Over to, is Shruti going to be the one who's going to close, or Anushka?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you everyone for joining in, and we hope to see you next week at the Wednesday seminar. Have a good day.
Thank you.